They say power is knowing what someone wants and keeping it just out of reach.
I was good at that.
Too good. Until Liam walked in. This is a fictional emotional story for reflective and narrative purposes. My name is Vivian Hale, and I've spent most of my adult life understanding the quiet language of power. Not the loud kind that shouts across rooms or forces decisions, but the kind that lingers in a pause, the lift of an eyebrow, the way a question goes unanswered just long enough to make someone lean in. I didn't chase love. I curated it, carefully, deliberately. They say power is knowing what someone wants most, and never giving it fully. I've mastered that, turning glances into tension, moments into memories, desire into control. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Men called me intoxicating, mysterious, even dangerous, but no one ever got close enough to see why. Then one summer evening, Liam arrived. He was supposed to be temporary, a favor to my husband Daniel, our son Max's friend, staying for a few weeks before his graduate program began.
Just another guest.
Just another name I wouldn't remember in a year. But from the first time I saw him standing in the kitchen, slightly unsure of where to place his hands, polite to the point of discomfort, I knew he wasn't like the others. He didn't try to impress. He didn't flirt. He barely looked at me, and that intrigued me, because men usually looked. Men usually lingered. But Liam? He held back. And suddenly, I wanted to know what it would take for him to stop. That was the beginning. Not of an affair, not of a scandal, but of something far quieter, far more dangerous. A shift in balance I didn't expect. Evenings in our house had a rhythm. The quiet hum of the dishwasher, the muted clink of ice in a glass, the long sighs of the walls settling in. I had always moved through these spaces like a ghost wrapped in silk, present, but untouchable. That night, I wore one of my older robes, ivory, soft at the sleeves, the belt tied loosely enough to feel like I didn't mean anything by it. But of course I did. I wasn't dressing for Liam. Not exactly. I was dressing for the space between us. The unspoken current that had begun to ripple, subtle but impossible to ignore. He'd offered to bring up a box of books Max had left behind. I said yes because politeness demanded it, and also because I wanted to see what he would do in the silence of my room. When he knocked and stepped in, he didn't look at me at first. Just placed the box down near the bookshelf and dusted his hands off. I didn't know where to put them, he said. His voice was careful.
Steady.
I was sitting at the edge of the bed, one leg crossed over the other, robe shifting as I leaned slightly forward. Right there is fine, I said softly, then paused, waited. Liam turned finally, and for the briefest moment his gaze caught on me. But it wasn't lingering. It wasn't bold. It was uncertain, like he wasn't sure whether to acknowledge the tension or pretend it wasn't there. That hesitation, that flicker of restraint, that was the moment I knew he wasn't playing a game, but I was. And I suddenly wanted to know if I could make someone who wasn't playing still lose. Are you always this quiet? I asked. He gave a small, awkward smile. I just try not to cross any lines. I tilted my head. Lines are only dangerous if you don't see them coming.
He didn't respond.
The room seemed smaller now, not because we had moved, but because something else had. When he left a minute later, the air stayed behind, warm and stretched thin like an overplayed note. And I sat there in my room, robe slipping slightly off one shoulder, wondering why someone so composed had left me. Curious, not about what I could do to him, but what he might eventually do to me. The next morning, sunlight crept across the hardwood floor like it was tiptoeing through a memory. I moved through the kitchen slowly, robe tied a little too loosely to be accidental, yet just enough to claim innocence. Liam was already there, hair still damp from a shower, a mug of coffee in one hand, the other scrolling through his phone. There was something unshakably calm about him.
Too calm.
I leaned against the counter, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel like a test.
Morning, I said.
He looked up briefly, just enough to be polite.
Morning.
That was it. No chishitashchin. No subtle glance down the line of my collarbone.
No pause.
He was present physically, but his mind? Somewhere else. Or worse, focused. And that unsettled me. I tilted my head, watching him. Did you sleep well? I asked softer this time. He nodded, eyes still on the mug. I did, but the way his fingers tightened around the handle, almost imperceptibly, betrayed something else. So there it was, restraint. And not the kind that wavers. It was the kind that holds. I'd seen it before, in different forms, usually from men who were afraid to want something too much. But this wasn't fear. It was self-control, rooted, intentional, and somehow that made it harder to look away. Because I wasn't used to being ignored, not by someone who had already noticed me. When he left the room, coffee half drunk and eyes unreadable, I stayed behind. The echo of his absence hung heavier than I expected, like he'd taken the upper hand without even reaching for it. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, not because I had something to say, but because I didn't know how I had become the one holding her breath. It's strange how silence can feel louder at night. The house was still. Even the floorboards seemed to hold their breath. Daniel, my husband, was out of town. Max, our son, was staying at a friend's. That left just two people under this roof.
Me.
And Liam. I didn't plan anything. At least, that's what I told myself. But my steps down the hallway were too careful. My robe, too deliberately draped. And the way I paused outside Max's old room, where Liam had been staying, that wasn't chance. From behind the door, I heard it. The steady stream of running water. A faint hum of a shower. Steam drifted from the narrow gap in the door, curling outward like a whisper I wasn't meant to hear. I should have turned away. Respectable distance.
Age.
Boundaries. But something in me moved, a part one hadn't listened to in years. The bathroom door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, just enough. Through the frosted glass, I could make out his silhouette. Strong lines, broad shoulders, water trailing down the length of his back. He ran a hand through his wet hair, unaware he was being watched. But I wasn't watching. Not really. I was wondering what would happen if he turned and saw me. Would he be startled? Would he reach for a towel? Would he say my name like it was a question or an accusation? Or would he say nothing at all? I stood there longer than I meant to, not because I wanted him, but because I didn't know why I couldn't leave. I wasn't used to feeling this, unsure, this exposed. And that's when I realized, for all the times I'd carefully orchestrated longing in others, this was the first time I was standing at the edge of my own. I didn't open the shower door.
Didn't speak.
Didn't move. I just stood in the mist, long enough to feel the heat against my skin and the weight of a decision I hadn't made. Then, just as quietly, I slipped back down the hallway, alone, but not untouched. Because Liam hadn't seen me, and yet somehow I felt as though he had. The next morning, I expected tension. Not mine, his. Averted eyes, uneasy silences, that familiar flicker of shame that follows restrained desire. But what I found was something else entirely. Liam was already in the kitchen.
Calm. Composed.
The morning light brushed the side of his face, catching in his jawline and softening him into something almost unreadable. He didn't glance up when I entered, didn't pause, not even when I let my silk robe shift just slightly at the shoulder, as if by accident. And maybe in another life it would have been. I waited. I moved closer. Nothing. He stirred his coffee slowly, methodically, as if the mug was the only thing in the room worth focusing on. "You're quiet today," I said, letting my tone bend somewhere between amused and curious. He nodded. "Didn't sleep much." His voice was even, not clipped, not cold, just grounded, too grounded. And I couldn't decide if I was impressed or offended. It wasn't the silence that got to me. It was what was missing inside it. There was no ache in his glance, no hesitation in his hands, no war behind his eyes. He was there, but beyond me, and that made me feel something I didn't expect. Uncertain. I took a step forward, close enough that the edge of my robe brushed against his arm. He flinched just slightly, but not because of weakness, because of discipline. "You should get more rest," I said, keeping my voice light low. "You'll need your strength."
He looked at me then.
Briefly, and whatever I thought I'd see, longing, tension, guilt, wasn't there. There was only quiet and something dangerously close to control. His control. That night, as I stood in front of the mirror, I ran my fingers along the edge of my robe, adjusting, readjusting, searching for something I couldn't name. Liam hadn't chased. He hadn't asked. He hadn't fallen. And suddenly, I realized I didn't want him to beg. I wanted him to need me. And I was no longer sure if he did. The wine was just a prop. 2 glasses. 1 untouched bottle. A room lit not by overhead lamps, but by shadows, stretched long and slow across the hardwood floor. Liam entered when I called him. He always did. But this time, he didn't stop at the doorway like before. He walked in with steady steps, his posture calm, eyes unreadable. "You're doing well," I said, lifting my glass. Playing compose. He didn't answer right away. Just watched the wine swirl as I tipped the glass toward my lips. I gave him a small smile, one I'd used on men who should have known better. "You think you've built a resistance, don't you?" Still no answer, just silence, and the kind of stillness that said more than words ever could. I handed him the second glass. "Sit with me," I offered, voice soft enough to suggest comfort and sharp enough to imply consequence.
He did.
He took the wine, but barely sipped it. His gaze flicked to me, briefly, before settling on the table between us. There was a moment, tense quiet, a fragile space where neither of us wanted to be the first to speak. And then I leaned in, just slightly, my voice lowering as I asked, "Liam, what's been on your mind lately?" He exhaled through his nose, a sound that was half laugh, half exhaustion. "This break," he said slowly, "has been strange."
"Oh."
I tilted my head. "In what way?" He turned to face me fully then, and what I saw in his eyes made my breath catch. Not lust, not longing, but something deeper. Conviction. "Because of you," he said simply. I smiled, feigning innocence. "Me? You push. You pull. You draw me in, then leave me just close enough to feel what I can't have." I leaned back, amused. "And you followed." "I did," he admitted, his jaw tense. "Because part of me thought I could handle it. And now?" I asked. "Now I know I can't." The confession should have felt like a win, like a ribbon tied at the end of a well-played game. But it didn't. It felt heavy, real. His eyes softened, just barely. "You drive me mad, Vivian," he said quietly. "But you also make me feel more awake than I've felt in a long time." I stood then, slowly, carefully, moved toward him, closing the distance until I could feel the warmth of his breath. I reached up, brushing my fingers just beneath his jawline, and whispered, "I forgive you." He blinked. For what? For trying to resist. And then, without warning, I kissed him. Not long, not deep, just enough to say I could. Just enough to remind him what he still hadn't had. And before he could respond, before he could lean in and take more, I pulled back, leaving him suspended between ache and anger. And with a slow, teasing smile, I whispered, "Let's dance." The music was soft, almost distant, one of those old, slow jazz records that made time stretch and eyes linger too long. We didn't speak. Liam stood before me, hesitant at first, then closing the distance with deliberate restraint. He offered his hand. I placed mine in it. We danced. Not the kind of dance that lives in ballrooms or at weddings, but the kind that lives in the spaces between heartbeats.
Close. Silent.
Loaded. His hand rested lightly at my waist. Not claiming, not commanding, just there, present.
His touch had changed.
It wasn't tentative anymore. It was steady, controlled, and somehow that made it more dangerous than desire ever had. I leaned in, letting my lips graze the shell of his ear. "You're holding back," I whispered. He didn't deny it, didn't move, didn't flinch. "Why?" I pressed. He let out a breath, slow and measured. "Because I have to."
Who told you that?
"No one," he said, voice low. "It's what I tell myself. Every day." I pulled back just enough to look at him.
His jaw was clenched.
His eyes, dark with something that wasn't hunger.
It was conflict.
And for the first time, I didn't want to win. I wanted to understand. My fingers trailed lightly up his chest, and I felt him tense beneath them. He wasn't resisting me. He was resisting himself. And in that moment, I saw the truth written all over his silence. He wasn't playing the game. He was surviving it. "Tell me what you want," I asked, barely above a whisper. "Right now." His hand tightened at my back. His breath hitched. "I want you," he breathed. 3 words. Simple. Devastating. Because this wasn't the kind of want that fades at dawn. It wasn't about skin or moments stolen in secret. It was something deeper, more dangerous, because it meant I could hurt him and that he would still come closer. I leaned in again, brushing my nose against his, our foreheads barely touching. And for the first time in all my carefully crafted nights of power and play, I didn't want him to beg. I wanted him to stay. The door closed behind me softly, but the echo felt louder than it should have. I leaned against it, breath shallow, heart still fluttering somewhere between thrill and fear. For days, I had built this dance with Liam, step by step, gesture by gesture, a masterclass in slow seduction and emotional control. But tonight, it was different. When I kissed him, I meant to remind him who I was. Instead, it reminded me of who I wasn't anymore. I stood in front of the mirror, watching the way the light caught the edge of my silk robe. It clung to me, elegant as always, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a question. What had I done? Or worse, what had I opened? Liam hadn't chased me down the hallway. He hadn't knocked on the door. He had let me walk away. And somehow, that was more intimate than any touch he could have given me. Later, when I returned to the kitchen, he was there, sitting at the counter again, sipping coffee, his posture relaxed. But the difference? This time, he didn't look up at all. Not even once. No lingering glance. No flinch. No recognition of the robe that had once made him tremble. I tried to break the silence gently. "Did you sleep?"
I asked.
He nodded. Eventually, his voice was quiet, steady, like a door had been quietly closed on me. I leaned on the opposite counter, close enough for the hem of my robe to shift, revealing just enough. Still nothing. Not a breath caught. Not a flicker in his gaze. He was composed, centered, untouchable. And suddenly, I was the one unraveling. "Liam," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. He looked up, but there was no tension in his shoulders. No need behind his eyes. Only a calmness that scared me more than any distance ever had. I had built my power on reaction, on being the cause of someone else's chaos. But now he was still, and I was the storm. I left the kitchen quickly, retreating into the shadows of the hallway like someone who no longer belonged in the light. Once in my room, I sat at the edge of the bed, robe still wrapped tightly, as if that alone could hold me together. And for the first time, I said something out loud I'd never admitted to myself before. I don't know what happens next. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay still, the sheets cool against my skin, the ceiling above me unfamiliar despite years beneath it. Everything felt distant, even my own thoughts. The game I'd mastered for years. The way I could draw someone in without ever having to give anything real. It had finally collapsed. And the most terrifying part? I missed him. Not the chase. Not the power. Him. Liam had seen something in me I hadn't meant to show. And unlike the others, he didn't try to possess it. He respected it, held it in quiet reverence, then stepped back when I expected him to fall. That's what broke me. Not his desire, but his refusal to be consumed by mine. By morning, I had rehearsed what I would say. Something measured. Something clever. Something that would restore the roles we knew. But when I entered the kitchen, I didn't find the boy I used to toy with. I found a man who had chosen his peace over my pull. Liam stood at the counter, rinsing a cup. His back was to me, his posture relaxed. "Morning," I said. He turned slightly. Morning. No tension. No shift in breath. Just presence.
Genuine.
Grounded. I stepped closer, not to seduce, but to be seen. And when he finally met my gaze, there was something in his eyes I hadn't earned, but deeply needed. Understanding. "I was unfair to you," I said quietly. "No," he replied. "You were afraid." I nodded. Silence wrapped around us like a gentle truth. Not cruel, not final, just honest. Then he added softly, "But you let me see you anyway. And that means something." And that's when I knew this wasn't about winning. It never had been. The real risk was never seduction. It was connection. And the real power was in letting go. I watched him pick up his jacket from the back of the chair. He paused, looked at me, not with longing, but with care. "Take care of yourself, Vivian," he said. "The real you." Then he left. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't chase. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for narrative and emotional exploration. All characters, relationships, and events are entirely imaginary. It is not intended to encourage or reflect real-life actions and should be viewed as a psychological and creative journey. Viewer discretion is advised.